Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Matchday 6 cheat sheet. We're at the semi-final stage of the European Championships, and if you haven't seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a tier list of the players based on position. Now, the players are obviously ordered in terms of price point, but obviously since we've entered into the 105 million budget stage of the tournament, which is obviously the knockout stages, I haven't really been tiering players necessarily on their sort of price, right? It's more about price agnostic, how good are these players, and I've kept it as such. For the semifinals, of course, I think everyone really is within reach in terms of if you want to create a squad, very hard to even probably breach that limit of 105 million anyways. So all these players, as I said, have been tiered really based on my preferences in general, as opposed to a reflection of their price. So in terms of the midfield position, starting off here, I think the first thing I'll mention is that all these fixtures, right, for these semi-final games are going to be quite defensive. We've seen that England have been defensive. We've seen that France have been defensive. And what does that mean? That probably means regardless of what you might have expectations for the Spanish attack or even the Dutch attack, the reality is it's probably going to be quite a low-scoring affair. These have been really the nature of the semi-final games, with exception to maybe Spain versus Germany. And of course, we expected something from Netherlands versus Turkey, but of course, facing off versus England now, we could assume that it could be quite a dull affair. And to be fair to France and England, they've been very defensive, but for a good reason, right? They've also ensured that ultimately they've more than often created more chances than their opponent, and they've got themselves to this point in the tournament as a result of their strong defense. And I think, of course, you still have to pick your best midfielders, and we're probably not going to pick all the goal scorers and the assisters, but we'll try our best. So starting with the midfielders, I think, unfortunately, a lot of these center mids are just not that relevant at this stage in the tournament, right? I'm not particularly keen in going for Schoten or Reinders, so they're just differentials to me. Kante, and even maybe you can argue someone like Tchouaméni, I think are probably the more interesting players. Even Rabiot, previously featured for the French team, but Tchouaméni is someone who we know that takes a lot of long shots. Kante, I think, is someone that I probably still prefer because I tend to see that he's involved in quite a few actions, even in the advanced third. So that's quite nice for Kante. And of course, his minutes are probably a little bit better than everyone else. And the ball recoveries are also just a touch better. However, the one thing about Kante that I'll mention at this stage in the tournament is that his ball recoveries per 90 are not nearly as high as you'd think they would be. Rodri and Rice, the two players who are obviously, your DMs from the Premier League, have actually proven to be much, much better at ball recoveries. And so at this stage in the tournament, I think the issue is if Kante averages around 4 ball recoveries a game, that's basically just 1 extra point, whereas at least Rice and Rodri almost guarantee you 2 extra points, which is quite a big difference because, of course, we've seen games from Rodri and Rice where they've gone way above that. Rodri in the previous match got 14. Rice is actually he's actually been a little bit different in the sense that he's been much more consistent. Kante, on the other hand, has actually averaged quite a low amount of ball recoveries. Fabian Ruiz actually has better ball recoveries than Kante, and of course probably is a little bit more interesting on the offensive end of things. So for that reason, I do really like Fabian Ruiz. He's obviously been the most productive player for Spain so far, and his minutes still look really good, right? He was subbed off in extra time versus Germany, but that's still better than, for example, typically what you'd see from, let's say, Morata, from Yamal, from even maybe Olmo, of course, in this situation where he's going to start the game once again, and he put on a huge shift in extra time even versus Spain versus Germany. So that's the thing I'll mention. Rice, of course, being added is quite huge. He's not necessarily someone who's going to produce a lot of goals and assists, but I think the overarching theme that we've seen, of course, with these tough fixtures, with these sort of condensed games, is that ultimately someone who can get you avenues to points even in the tougher matches are going to be better than someone who probably you'd only want to have if the game was a little bit more one-sided. So I can understand at this stage in the tournament, if you actually want to prefer to go for Rice over, let's say, Saka or Bellingham, I don't think that's actually crazy, right? We're at the stage of the tournament where, once again, the points are really far and few between. It's very likely that our offenses can very much blank because of how strong England and France are as defenses. And in my opinion, once again, the ball recoveries are very significant. So what you can see, of course, in the 7 million tier is that I clearly have a huge preference for Williams. I do think the Dutch are going to struggle versus the English. Clean sheet odds also definitely do back that. But just generally speaking, of course, Simons hasn't been overly productive, right? So from all the midfielders, the drop off from, for example, previously what was Musiala, even Bruno, arguably, our expectations for someone like Simons are much less. And of course, it's his really toughest fixture in the tournament so far, outside of, let's say, when they faced France the first time round. And so I think Simons definitely does deserve to drop. So Olmo definitely rising here, or really being a new addition. Really unfortunate injury with Pedri, but of course Olmo was the man of the match for Spain. And to be honest, for a long time, even extending back to the previous Euros now, Olmo has been a key player for Spain, and as long as he's been injury free, he's been a very quintessential player for us. in the sort of more premium tiers, I've really just given Saka a rise. I think the reason why we always had a little bit of hesitancy towards Saka, despite him actually being, you know, a very lively player for most of the games for England, is that we always saw that Southgate would sub off Saka in most of these games, right? We saw Saka being subbed off early for effectively all the matches leading up to the Switzerland game. And of course, in the Switzerland game, he was allowed to go all the way up until extra time. And I think for a very deserving reason, right? He was the most impactful attacker for England for the entire match. And to be fair, you can go back to previous games, and I think you could make even the same arguments just generally in open play. You know, outside of like key actions, like for example, Bellingham scoring goals. I mean, Saka for the most part has been the chance creator for this English side. So him getting really good minutes finally is a good sign for me to just say, hopefully Southgate will recognize that Saka needs to stay on the pitch. And that's pretty much it. I think Saka definitely someone that we all love to have versus Netherlands, and for that reason he gets a rise. Foden, of course, the minutes are still, in my opinion, a bit shaky. Once again, of course, that left-hand side attack of England has been pretty much depleted because of, I guess, the sort of interplay of that whole triangle of, let's say, Jude, Foden, and Trippier, of course, being a right-footed left-back. And unfortunately, it hasn't really been too productive on the left. But I think we saw slightly better actions, you know, involving the three of these players and in open play, of course. And I think Foden's minutes are still probably the worst out of all the attackers. So for that reason, he still remains at that yellow tier for me. Whereas Bellingham, for me, still an interesting pick. Definitely probably a little bit more goal dominant. Definitely not as, you know, creative necessarily compared to, let's say, Foden and Saka. Moving towards the forwards now. I think the only change that I've reflected here is, unfortunately, of course, the change in fixture moving from Turkey to England for the Dutch team, unfortunately. And that means Gakpo and Depay both drop. I still think that they're actually great, right? If you've been owning Gakpo and Depay so far, there's absolutely no reason to really move away from them as picks. And ultimately, if you have, let's say, a front line that's, let's say, Gakpo, Kane, and Mbappe, you can absolutely keep that in place. If you're wildcarding, though, I think there's a genuine temptation to maybe consider going for Yamal potentially instead. Now, I do think the toughest thing is, of course, Yamal's ultimately up against this sort of French defense, which have proven to be very tough. But at the same time, I can say, of course, you might want to pick them in isolation anyways above Gakpo and Depay in most days. So it really comes down to sort of your qualitative judgment on how you think Spain versus France will go versus how you think Netherlands versus England will go. And I think, you know, all conclusions are pretty much valid, because if you look at some of the betting odds, some of the AI models that are predicting some of these games, it's very close. It's basically a 50-50. Once again, very much like matchday 5 with Spain and Germany and France and Portugal. So something to think about there. Mbappe and Kane, we still like them because the minutes still look good. They are still penalty takers. At the end of the day, players like Dembele, Griezmann, even Morata have susceptible minutes, and, you know, your chances to get something even when you go to something like extra time is going to be worse, because even though Mbappe got subbed off in extra time, it's not like he's someone who's prone to getting subbed off like Griezmann, for example, at 45 minutes, which I think was a great shock. But given that he was also previously benched at one point in the tournament and overall just hasn't been playing too well, probably because he's 33 and has played a ton of football games this season and is probably overrun, to be quite honest, that's sort of how things stand for the forward position. Very, very dull, but definitely for the wild carders, I do think Yamal might be that sort of differential pick that could be, you know, worth opening your eyes to. As far as the defense, moving on over there, I do think that Guehi coming back, he should immediately slot back into the team. Funnily enough, when I found out that Trippier was actually going to be part of that sort of predicted starting 11 for England, when we all thought it was going to be a back five, or at least when the media reported it as a back five, I actually posted on a group chat that I thought that was nonsense and that it was going to be a back four. And obviously, one game into England versus Switzerland, we knew very clearly it wasn't a back five. So I do think that Guehi will come back to the team. I think the biggest asterisk, of course, is going to be, unfortunately, you're not going to have the lineup for the games. So you'll have to sort of make a guess on to whether someone like Shaw can play. I think once again, it has to go back to, particularly with Shaw, for example, him getting injured in the previous time that this effectively happened with Man United, right? They sort of rushed him back. They started him on his first fixture. I just find it quite hard to believe that Shaw will be sort of risked like that, particularly when the medical staff for England have been very cautious with him. I think if anything, it has to be a small, brief cameo first before he even gets to start the World Cup final, if that's even the plan. And for the most part, I think Trippier would still play. But clearly, of course, he is lacking in ball recoveries, where someone like Guehi has proven to be incredible for ball recoveries. Stone's a little bit better, but for the most part, Walker and Stones have been pretty dull. I think you can definitely just in general pick someone like Walker for the most part, but there's not really too much splitting between Stones and Walker, in my opinion, because they're both two players so far for within this tournament, of course, who simply haven't actually amassed too many ball recoveries compared to some of the other leading sort of candidates in the center back position. So, for example, you can see players like Laporte, like Koundé, like Cucurella. All of these players have actually averaged more than 6 ball recoveries per game. And that sort of tier is very nice, because that means that you're guaranteeing that second ball recovery point. Whereas, of course, if you're someone who's averaging below 6, I mean, generally speaking, we're not expecting too many points in the future. Now, of course, we know that there are a lot of single one-game situations which are absolutely crazy, right? For example, Cucurella, actually, a lot of his ball recoveries really still come back down to the Italy game. For Rodri, for example, the previous match, he got 14. But I think generally speaking, unless we saw previously from like sort of domestic results, and I think Walker's a good example of that. Walker has really good domestic ball recovery numbers, but as you can see, obviously, within this tournament, him and Stones have been pretty dull for ball recoveries. Nacho as well has been poor, but of course, it's a very, very small sample size. I still think, obviously, between him and Laporte, even when we were watching the game versus Germany, it seemed like Laporte was definitely a little bit more dominant of the two when it came down to ball recoveries. And with Lenormand being suspended, we have Nacho coming in. So that's the only thing I'll say about ball recoveries. Now, going back to the actual picks, though, I think Guecki, for me, is my favorite pick, really, of all the defenders. Cucurella should still play once again for Spain. I think at the end of the day, it seems like he got subbed off a little bit early versus Georgia for potential rest reasons. But there's, of course, a bit more of a possibility that, let's say, Cucurella can always get subbed off for someone like Grimaldo. And we will find out the Spanish lineup. I do think we'll play with Navas, but it might be the case that you can see something like Cucurella right back, which has been the case. You know, it's happened before for Chelsea when they've been depleted from right backs, and then maybe we go Grimaldo left back. That could be a potential option that Spain sort of seek out, but I think that would be a bit of a loss to that sort of left wing position, because I think Cucurella and Nico Williams have sort of formed a nice little partnership there on the left. Koundé, Upamecano have been brilliant, as you can see. Saliba as well, really good. Upamecano, obviously a little bit worse in terms of ball recoveries. Koundé probably the best pick really out of all the French defenders. So he probably is the most dominant pick that I'd go with. But France are, as I said, very defensive team, and it does make sense to probably invest into the French defense if you'd like to. With players like Navas, probably not too many ball recoveries, but of course he could very well be on potential set pieces if, let's say, Grimaldo doesn't play. So I think that's very nice. However, of course, I do think, thinking back about it, Yamal and Williams will probably do most of the corners because they have that sort of 1-2 corner routine on both flanks. And of course, Navas can maybe take the routine if we tend to, let's say, sub off some of these youngsters later into the game. So that could happen. With De Vrij, with Van Dijk, with Ake, with Dumfries, I just think that, honestly, out of all the four fixtures and all the four teams, sorry, 2 fixtures and 4 teams, I do think that the Dutch probably stand the worst chance of getting towards the finals. And at the same time, I'd probably have the least expectations of them in the finals anyways. And I think they do have the toughest fixture in the semifinals as it stands. So from that as a perspective, with them having the least clean sheet odds, I do think I'm going to have to drop all the Dutch defenders like so. Once again, my general preference for this tournament, as we've seen things go on and as the games get tougher, is that I think center backs are just much, much better. As you can see, De Vrij and Van Dijk actually are leading, obviously, the sort of Dutch team in terms of ball recoveries. Ake and Dumfries, their ball recovery numbers per 90 are much lower. And keep in mind as well, Ake is someone who doesn't actually play the full 90 minutes. So you can't even necessarily extrapolate it like so. You should probably actually downgrade the amount of ball recoveries you'd expect from Ake, which is also why I was not really fond of Ake, for example, for matchday 5. As far as Hernandez, he's still one of those players where at the end of the day, he still averages enough ball recoveries to probably get that 1 point. So he's sort of in line with someone like Stones, but he's just such an offensive player where I think there's always still a bit of upside with him, really. And France have just been such a solid defense that I've given really all of them effectively a tier rise. And that's pretty much it. I think it comes down to the fact that I think England and France and Spain are probably the teams that I'd spend a lot of my defensive money on. And I think I've kind of shown a preference for players who are ultimately going to get more ball recoveries within those circumstances. Van Dijk is still amazing just for the overall aspect of the set piece threat. But of course, De Vrij getting the goal, I mean, that happens, right? It's not like Van Dijk will always get chances. He hit the post, I believe, versus Romania. So of course he's still going to be the main threat really when it comes to set pieces for the Dutch, but something to think about. As far as the goalkeepers, the only thing I've really done to reflect obviously the tough fixture that the Dutch have in front of them is going to be, let's say, Verbruggen getting a drop and Magnan getting a rise, and that's simply coming down to the fact that France have been very, very impenetrable as a defense, and the Dutch obviously, as we said, expect to be probably the weakest defensive team remaining in the tournament. And that's pretty much it. So thank you guys so much for watching the cheat sheet. I hope this video helps you out. All the best for the rest of the tournament so far, and enjoy the semi-final games, and I'll see you guys in the next video.